Linda Martinez sat in her small kitchen, staring at the official-looking letter that had arrived in her mailbox that morning. The return address showed Peterson and Associates, attorneys at law, printed in fancy gold letters on thick white paper. Her hands shook slightly as she read the words again, unable to believe what they were asking of her. The letter was short but formal. It requested her presence at the reading of Richard Coleman's will. Richard Coleman, her ex-husband who had left her 3 years ago for his young secretary, the same man who had fought her tooth and nail during their divorce, making sure she got as little as possible from their 12 years of marriage. Linda set the letter down on her small dining table and rubbed her temples. She had not spoken to Richard since the day their divorce became final. That day, he had looked at her with cold eyes and said she would never amount to anything without him. Those words still hurt even now. The lawyer's letter said her attendance was legally required. Linda did not understand why. During the divorce, Richard had made it very clear that he wanted nothing to do with her ever again. His new wife, Amanda, had gotten everything: the big house, the fancy cars, and, most importantly, Richard's love and attention. Linda walked to her bathroom mirror and looked at herself. At 42, she still looked good, but the stress of the past few years showed on her face. The divorce had been hard on her in every way. She had to move out of their beautiful home into this tiny apartment. She had to take a part-time job at a local bookstore just to pay her bills. The small amount of alimony Richard gave her barely covered her basic needs. She thought about Richard's family and how they would react to seeing her at the will reading. His mother, Dorothy Coleman, had never liked Linda from the day Richard brought her home. Dorothy always made comments about Linda's background, reminding everyone that Linda's father worked in a factory and her mother cleaned houses for rich families. Richard's brother Greg was even worse. He never missed a chance to point out that Linda was not good enough for their family. During family dinners, Greg would talk about his wife's expensive clothes and jewelry, then look at Linda like she was wearing rags. Even though Linda always dressed nicely, she could never afford the designer brands that the other Coleman women wore. The worst part was that Richard never stood up for her. He would just sit quietly while his family made their mean comments. Sometimes Linda wondered if Richard agreed with them, but was too polite to say so out loud. Now Richard was dead. Linda had heard about his heart attack from a neighbor who saw it on the local news. Richard Coleman, successful businessman, dead at 45. The news report mentioned his wife Amanda and her 2 children, but did not mention Linda at all. It was like their 12 years of marriage had never happened. Linda made herself a cup of coffee and read the letter one more time. The will reading was scheduled for next Tuesday at 10 in the morning. That was only 5 days away. She would have to ask for time off from work, which she could not really afford to do. She walked to her small closet and looked at her clothes. What do you wear to your ex-husband's will reading? Especially when you know his new wife and his family will be there, probably dressed in expensive black outfits that cost more than Linda made in a month. Linda had one good black dress that she wore to important events. It was simple but elegant, and it still fit her well. She had bought it for a work party 2 years ago, back when she thought she might start dating again. But dating had been the last thing on her mind lately. Working and paying bills took up most of her time and energy. The phone rang, startling her out of her thoughts. It was her sister Maria calling from California. "Linda, I just heard about Richard on the news out here. Are you okay?" Linda sat down heavily on her couch. "I'm fine, Maria. We've been divorced for 3 years. His death doesn't really affect me." But even as she said the words, Linda knew they were not completely true. She had loved Richard once, deeply and completely. When they first met at a company party 15 years ago, he had seemed like everything she had ever wanted in a man. He was handsome, successful, and he made her laugh. "Did you go to the funeral?" Maria asked. "No, I didn't think it would be appropriate. Amanda is his wife now. I didn't want to cause any drama." Linda told Maria about the lawyer's letter and the will reading. Maria was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's strange. Why would they want you there if Richard left you nothing?" "I don't know. Maybe it's just a legal thing. Maybe there's some small item he left me, like his old books or something. The lawyer said my attendance was required, so I have to go." After she hung up with Maria, Linda felt even more confused. She tried to think of any reason why Richard would leave her something in his will. During their marriage, she had helped him build his business. She had worked late nights, organized his files, made phone calls to clients, and even helped him write proposals. But Richard had always acted like the business success was all his doing. Linda remembered the early days of their marriage when money was tight and Richard was just starting Coleman Industries. She had worked 2 jobs to help pay their bills, while Richard focused on growing the company. She had believed in his dreams and supported him in every way she could, but apparently none of that mattered to Richard in the end. When he met Amanda, a 28-year-old secretary with long blonde hair and a sweet smile, he forgot all about the woman who had stood by him through the hard times. Linda looked around her small apartment and sighed. In 5 days, she would have to face Richard's family and his young widow. She would have to sit in that lawyer's office and pretend she belonged there, even though everyone would be looking at her like she was an unwelcome guest at a private party. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her purse. Whatever Richard had left her, if anything, she would accept it politely and leave as quickly as possible. She had learned to expect nothing from Richard Coleman, so she could not be disappointed. Linda stood outside the tall glass building that housed Peterson and Associates, trying to gather her courage. The law office was in the most expensive part of downtown, surrounded by other fancy businesses and expensive restaurants. She looked at her reflection in the building's glass doors and smoothed down her black dress one more time. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt like it lasted forever. Linda's heart was beating fast, and her hands were sweaty. She kept telling herself that this would be over soon, and then she could go back to her normal life and try to forget about Richard Coleman forever. The law office was even more impressive than Linda had expected. The floors were made of shiny marble and crystal lights hung from the ceiling. Expensive paintings covered the walls and fresh flowers sat on every table. Linda felt very out of place in this world of wealth and luxury. A young secretary with perfect makeup and an expensive suit smiled at Linda politely. "Are you here for the Coleman will reading? Right this way, please." Linda followed the secretary down a long hallway lined with offices. Through the open doors, she could see lawyers in expensive suits talking on phones and working at large wooden desks. Everything about this place screamed money and power. The secretary stopped at a large conference room and opened the door. "The family is already here. Please take a seat wherever you're comfortable." Linda stepped into the room and immediately felt like she had made a terrible mistake. The conference room was huge, with a long wooden table in the center surrounded by leather chairs. Large windows looked out over the city, and more expensive artwork decorated the walls. But it was not the fancy room that made Linda uncomfortable. It was the people sitting around that table, all staring at her like she was some unwelcome stranger who had wandered into their private party. Amanda Coleman sat at the head of the table, looking beautiful even in her grief. She wore a black, designer dress that probably cost more than Linda made in 3 months. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup looked flawless despite the tears she was dabbing from her eyes with a silk handkerchief. Around the table sat the rest of Richard's family, all dressed in expensive black clothes. Linda recognized most of them from family gatherings she had attended during her marriage to Richard. None of them looked happy to see her. Dorothy Coleman, Richard's mother, was the first to speak. She was a thin woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her black dress was clearly very expensive, and she wore diamond earrings that sparkled in the light from the windows. "Well, well," Dorothy said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I can't believe she had the nerve to show up here." Linda felt her face turn red, but she tried to ignore the comment and look for an empty chair. Most of the seats around the table were taken by family members, leaving only a few chairs along the wall. Greg Coleman, Richard's younger brother, stood up and walked over to Linda with a mean smile on his face. Greg was a successful lawyer himself, and he had always enjoyed making Linda feel small during family events. "Hello, Linda," Greg said, not bothering to keep his voice down. "I have to say I'm surprised to see you here. I thought you would have enough dignity to stay away." Linda looked around the room and saw that everyone was watching this conversation. Amanda was looking at her with a mixture of curiosity and pity. The other family members were whispering to each other behind their hands. The lawyer said my attendance was required, Linda said quietly, hoping to avoid making a scene. Greg laughed, but it was not a friendly sound. Oh, don't get your hopes up, Linda. We all know exactly how Richard felt about you after the divorce. He made it very clear that you meant nothing to him. You'll be lucky if he left you his old fishing equipment. Several people in the room chuckled at Greg's comment. Linda felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She refused to give these people the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Linda found an empty chair in the back corner of the room and sat down quietly. She folded her hands in her lap and tried to make herself invisible. She wished she had never come to this awful place. Amanda looked up from her handkerchief and spoke directly to Linda. Her voice was sweet, but Linda could hear the edge of cruelty underneath. Linda, I hope you understand that Richard and I had a wonderful life together. He often told me that he regretted wasting so many years before he found true happiness with me. He said his first marriage was the biggest mistake he ever made. The room became very quiet. Linda felt like Amanda had just slapped her across the face. She knew Amanda was lying, but she could not prove it. And even if Amanda was telling the truth, why did she need to say such hurtful things? Dorothy Coleman nodded approvingly at Amanda's words. Richard was so much happier after he married you, dear. We could all see the difference. He was like a new man. That's right, added Greg. Richard used to complain about his first wife all the time. He said she held him back from achieving his full potential. Linda wanted to stand up and leave right then. She wanted to tell all of these horrible people exactly what she thought of them. But she stayed in her chair because the lawyer's letter had said her attendance was required. She had to see this through, no matter how painful it was. Richard's Uncle Bob, a heavy man with gray hair, leaned over to his wife and whispered loudly, I never understood what Richard saw in her in the first place. She was never good enough for our family. His wife nodded and whispered back, Poor Richard, trapped in that marriage for so many years. Thank goodness he found Amanda. Linda stared at her hands and tried to block out their voices. She thought about all the years she had spent trying to fit in with this family, all the holiday dinners where she had smiled politely while they made their cruel comments, all the times she had bought expensive gifts she could not afford, trying to win their approval. The door opened and a tall man in an expensive suit walked in carrying a briefcase. This had to be Mr. Peterson, the lawyer. Linda was grateful for the interruption. Maybe now they could get this over with and she could escape from this nightmare. Mr. Peterson looked around the room and smiled professionally. Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry for your loss. Shall we begin? Linda took a deep breath and prepared herself for whatever was coming next. She told herself that nothing these people could say would hurt her anymore. She just had to get through the next hour, and then she could leave this place forever. Mr. Peterson sat down at the head of the table and opened his briefcase. He was a man in his 60s with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore an expensive dark suit and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had been doing this job for many years. Thank you all for coming today, Mr. Peterson said in a calm, professional voice. I know this is a difficult time for everyone. Before we begin, I want to remind you that this is a legal proceeding, and I ask that everyone remain respectful throughout. Linda noticed that he looked directly at Greg Coleman when he said this. Maybe Mr. Peterson had dealt with difficult family members before. The lawyer pulled out a thick document from his briefcase and placed it on the table in front of him. This is the last will and testament of Richard James Coleman, dated and signed just 2 months before his death. I will read through the document in its entirety, starting with the smaller bequests and moving to the larger ones. Linda shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She wondered how long this would take, and how much more cruelty she would have to endure from Richard's family. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat and began reading. I, Richard James Coleman, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament. First, to the American Red Cross I leave the sum of $10,000. He continued reading through a list of charitable donations. Richard had left money to several organizations, including the local hospital, a scholarship fund at his old college, and an animal shelter. Linda was surprised by the charitable gifts. During their marriage, Richard had never seemed particularly interested in helping others. To my cousin Paul Coleman in Denver, I leave my collection of golf clubs and my membership to Oakwood Country Club, Mr. Peterson continued. Paul Coleman, a thin man with a mustache, smiled and nodded to the people sitting around him. Richard always said I was the better golfer, he whispered to his wife. To my dear friend and business partner, Steve Martinez, I leave my vintage wine collection and my boat, the Amanda's Dream. Linda felt a small stab of pain hearing the name of Richard's boat. He had bought it after marrying Amanda and named it after his new wife. During their marriage, Richard had owned a small fishing boat that Linda had helped him pick out. They had spent many happy weekends on that boat, but Richard had sold it during the divorce. Mr. Peterson looked up from the document. Now we move to the family bequests. To my beloved mother, Dorothy Coleman, I leave my grandfather's antique pocket watch collection, valued at approximately $50,000. Dorothy Coleman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue and nodded graciously. Richard's grandfather would be so pleased, she said. Those watches have been in our family for 3 generations. Linda remembered those watches. Dorothy had shown them to her many times during family visits, always making sure to mention how valuable and important they were. Linda had always admired them, but Dorothy had made it clear that they would never belong to anyone outside the Coleman bloodline. To my brother, Greg Coleman, I leave the family cabin in Colorado, along with all furnishings and recreational equipment. Greg Coleman's face lit up with a big smile. That's wonderful, he said, turning to his wife. We've always loved that place. Linda felt another sharp pain in her chest. She and Richard had spent their honeymoon at that cabin 15 years ago. They had also spent many anniversaries there, and Linda had even helped Richard renovate the kitchen and bathroom just 5 years ago. She had painted walls, installed new fixtures, and planted flowers in the garden. But now it belonged to Greg, who had never lifted a finger to help with any improvements. Mr. Peterson continued reading. To Amanda's children, Katie and Brandon Price, I leave educational trust funds of $100,000 each to be used for college expenses. Amanda smiled through her tears and squeezed the hands of her 2 teenage children, who were sitting on either side of her. Richard always treated you like his own children, she whispered to them. Linda looked at Katie and Brandon, both attractive teenagers who had barely acknowledged Linda's presence in the room. During the 3 years Richard was married to Amanda, Linda had heard through mutual friends that Richard had become very close to Amanda's children, taking them on expensive vacations and buying them cars for their birthdays. To my sister-in-law, Carol Coleman, I leave my collection of first edition books valued at approximately $25,000. Carol Coleman, Greg's wife, gasped with delight. Oh my goodness, Richard knew how much I loved his library. Linda had loved those books too. She and Richard had collected many of them together during their marriage, visiting old bookstores and auction houses on weekends. Some of her happiest memories with Richard involved hunting for rare books and discussing literature late into the night. The lawyer paused and took a sip of water from a glass that his secretary had brought in. Now we come to the major bequests. To my beloved wife, Amanda Coleman, I leave our family home at 1247 Maple Grove Lane, along with all furnishings, artwork, and personal belongings contained within. Amanda began crying harder, but they seemed like tears of joy mixed with grief. That house was our dream home, she said. Richard designed every detail himself. Linda knew that was not true. Richard had bought that house during their marriage, and Linda had helped choose everything from the paint colors to the landscaping. But apparently Richard had rewritten history in his mind, just like he had rewritten everything else about their life together. Additionally, to Amanda Coleman, I leave my investment portfolio with Morrison Financial, valued at approximately $800,000. The room filled with impressed murmurs. $800,000 was more money than most people would see in a lifetime. Furthermore, to Amanda Coleman, I leave my collection of classic automobiles, including the 1967 Mustang, the 1972 Corvette, and the 1969 Camaro. Greg Coleman whistled softly. Those cars are worth at least $200,000. Linda remembered helping Richard restore that Mustang in their garage during the early years of their marriage. She had spent countless weekends handing him tools and learning about engines. When they finished the restoration, Richard had promised that car would be hers someday. Amanda was now sobbing openly, but Linda could see the satisfaction in her eyes. She had inherited a house, investments, and valuable cars. She was set for life. Greg Coleman could not resist another cruel comment. "Well, Linda, looks like you're going home empty-handed today. Just like Richard always said you would." Dorothy Coleman nodded and added with a cold smile, "Some people think they deserve rewards for being failures." Linda felt her face burning with shame and anger, but she kept quiet. She just wanted this horrible experience to be over. Mr. Peterson looked up from the document with a serious expression. Actually, there are still several more items to be read. The room became quiet when Mr. Peterson said there were still more items to be read. Linda looked around and saw that most of Richard's family members were smiling and chatting quietly among themselves. They seemed satisfied with what they had received and were probably just waiting for the lawyer to finish with some small final details. Amanda was still dabbing her eyes, but Linda could see she looked happy. She had inherited more than anyone else, which made sense since she was Richard's wife. The family members were congratulating her and talking about all the wonderful things Richard had left her. Greg Coleman leaned back in his chair with a satisfied look on his face. He kept glancing at Linda with that same mean smile he had worn earlier. Linda could tell he was enjoying her discomfort and was probably planning to make another cruel comment before she left. Dorothy Coleman was examining her diamond rings and looked very pleased with herself. She had gotten the valuable watch collection she had always treasured, and now she could pass it down to her sons and grandsons. Linda sat quietly in her corner chair, feeling smaller and more invisible with each passing minute. She wondered what small items might be left. Maybe Richard had left her some old books or kitchen items that nobody else wanted. She told herself it did not matter. She had not expected anything anyway. Mr. Peterson shuffled through the pages of the will and found what he was looking for. His expression became more serious and he cleared his throat to get everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to the final and most significant portion of Mr. Coleman's will," he announced in a formal voice. The room became completely silent. Even the family members stopped their quiet conversations and turned to look at the lawyer. Linda noticed that Mr. Peterson seemed different now, more official and careful with his words. "Regarding the bulk of Mr. Richard Coleman's estate," Mr. Peterson began, his voice clear and strong, "to my former wife, Linda Martinez, I leave my entire business empire, Coleman Industries, including all subsidiaries, international holdings, and associated assets." For a moment, nobody moved or spoke. It was like the whole room had frozen in time. Linda felt like she had been struck by lightning. She could not have heard that correctly. There was no way Richard would leave his business to her. Mr. Peterson continued reading in the same calm, professional voice. "The current estimated value of Coleman Industries and all related business assets is approximately $47 million. Amanda dropped her silk handkerchief and stared at the lawyer with her mouth open. The color drained from her face and she looked like she might faint. "This has to be a mistake," Dorothy Coleman shouted, jumping up from her chair so fast that it nearly fell over. "Richard would never leave his business to that woman, never." Greg Coleman was on his feet too, pointing his finger at Mr. Peterson. "Let me see that document right now. This is impossible. Richard hated her." But Mr. Peterson calmly held up his hand and continued reading as if nothing had happened. "Furthermore, to Linda Martinez, I leave my private investment portfolio managed by Sterling Financial Group, my real estate holdings in 7 states including commercial and residential properties, and my collection of vintage wines stored at Premium Wine Storage Facility." Linda could not breathe. The numbers were too big to understand. $47 million, real estate in 7 states. She had never even known Richard owned property outside of their home state. The combined value of these additional assets, Mr. Peterson continued, brings Mrs. Martinez's total inheritance to approximately $63 million. The conference room exploded into chaos. Amanda started screaming at the lawyer, demanding to know how this was possible. Dorothy Coleman was shouting about how the will must be fake. Greg Coleman was threatening to call his own lawyers and fight this in court. "This is fraud," Greg yelled. Richard was not in his right mind when he wrote this. He had a heart condition. He was probably confused. Other family members joined in the shouting. Richard's Uncle Bob was red in the face, demanding to see the document. Carol Coleman was crying and saying this could not be happening. The teenage children looked scared and confused by all the adult anger around them. Through all the noise and chaos, Linda sat perfectly still in her chair. She felt like she was watching a movie about someone else's life. This could not be real. People like her did not inherit $63 million. There had to be some terrible mistake. Mr. Peterson stood up and spoke in a loud, firm voice that cut through all the shouting. "Please, everyone, sit down and be quiet. I understand this is shocking news, but everything I have read is completely legal and valid." "But why?" Amanda cried out, her perfect makeup now streaked with tears. "Why would Richard do this to me? I thought he loved me." "Richard told me he regretted leaving Linda," Dorothy Coleman shouted. "He was going to change his will back. He just ran out of time." Greg Coleman slammed his hand on the table. "We'll fight this in court. No judge will believe Richard wanted to leave everything to his ex-wife." Mr. Peterson waited for the room to get quieter, then spoke directly to Linda, for the first time. "Mrs. Martinez, I know this is overwhelming news. Mr. Coleman updated his will just 2 months before his death. He was examined by 2 doctors who confirmed he was completely mentally competent when he made these changes." Linda finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "I don't understand. Why would he do this?" "Mr. Coleman left you a personal letter that explains his reasons," Mr. Peterson said gently. "He asked me to give it to you only after the will had been read to everyone present." The lawyer reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope with Linda's name written on it in Richard's handwriting. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely take it from him. Amanda was now crying hysterically. "This ruins everything. How am I supposed to take care of my children? Richard promised he would always provide for us. You still have the house and the cars and the investment account," Carol Coleman pointed out, but her voice sounded bitter. $800,000 seemed like a lot an hour ago, Greg said sarcastically. "But it's nothing compared to $63 million. Linda looked down at the envelope in her hands. Inside was Richard's explanation for the most shocking moment of her entire life. Part of her was afraid to read it, but she knew she had to understand why her ex-husband had just made her one of the richest women in the state. Linda stared at the sealed envelope in her trembling hands. The room was still filled with angry voices and crying, but everything seemed far away to her. She could see Richard's familiar handwriting on the envelope, neat and careful like always. Her name was written in blue ink across the front. Mr. Peterson spoke loudly to get everyone's attention. Mr. Coleman specifically requested that this letter be read aloud to everyone present after the inheritance was announced. "Mrs. Martinez, would you like me to read it, or would you prefer to read it yourself?" Linda's voice was barely a whisper. "Please, you read it. I don't think I can." She handed the envelope back to Mr. Peterson with shaking hands. He opened it carefully and pulled out 2 pages of paper covered in Richard's handwriting. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read in a clear, steady voice. "My dearest Linda, if you are hearing this letter, then you know about my final gift to you. I know you must be confused and probably shocked. The people in that room with you are probably very angry right now. But please let me explain why I have done this." Amanda was crying loudly, but Greg Coleman told her to be quiet so they could hear what Richard had written. Everyone in the room was listening carefully now, even though many of them looked furious. Mr. Peterson continued reading. "Linda, I need you to know that leaving you was the biggest mistake of my entire life. I was a fool who threw away the best thing that ever happened to me. I know saying sorry now cannot undo the pain I caused you, but I need you to understand the truth." Dorothy Coleman made a disgusted sound. "This is ridiculous. Richard was happy with Amanda. We all saw how happy he was. But Mr. Peterson kept reading. The truth is that I built Coleman Industries because of you, not in spite of you. Do you remember those early years when we had nothing? You worked 2 jobs to pay our bills while I chased my dream of starting a business. You believed in me when nobody else did, including my own family. Linda felt tears starting to roll down her cheeks as she remembered those difficult early years. She had worked at a restaurant during the day and cleaned offices at night. Also, Richard could focus on building his company. She had been so tired all the time, but she had never complained because she believed in Richard's vision. You were not just my wife, Linda. You were my partner in every way. You helped me write my first business proposals. You organized my files and made phone calls to potential clients. You stayed up late with me planning strategies and celebrating small victories. When I was ready to give up, you convinced me to keep trying. Greg Coleman was shaking his head in disbelief. This is not how I remember it. Richard always said he built that business by himself. Mr. Peterson looked up from the letter. There's more. He continued reading. My family never understood what you meant to me. They saw your working-class background and decided you were not good enough for us. But they were wrong. You had more class and dignity than any of them. You were kind to them even when they were cruel to you. You never fought back or said mean things even though they deserved it. Linda remembered all those family dinners where Dorothy and Greg had made their hurtful comments. She had always tried to be polite and respectful, hoping that eventually they would accept her. But they never did. I should have defended you, Linda. I should have told my family to treat you with respect or stay out of our lives. Instead, I was a coward who let them hurt you over and over again. I will regret that for the rest of my life. Amanda was staring at the lawyer with a shocked expression. This was not the Richard she thought she had married. The Richard she knew had always spoken poorly of his first wife. Mr. Peterson continued reading the letter. When I met Amanda, I was going through what people call a midlife crisis. She was young and beautiful, and she made me feel young too. I convinced myself that I had been unhappy with you, but that was a lie. The truth is that I was bored with my life and looking for excitement. I don't want to hear this, Amanda said, but her voice was weak. I threw away 12 years of real love for a few months of excitement. Amanda is a nice person, but she fell in love with my money and my success. You fell in love with me when I had nothing. There is a big difference, and I finally understood that. Richard's letter went on to explain how he had realized his mistake about 6 months before his death. He had started to see that Amanda loved the lifestyle he provided more than she loved him. When he had heart problems and faced the possibility of dying, he began to think seriously about his life and his choices. I know Amanda will be hurt by this letter, and I am sorry for that. But she is young and beautiful, and she will find someone else who can make her happy. She has her children and the house and enough money to live comfortably. But you, Linda, sacrificed your best years for me. You gave up your own dreams to help me achieve mine. Linda was crying openly now. She remembered how she had wanted to go back to school and become a teacher, but there had never been time or money while she was helping Richard build his business. The money I am leaving you is not just an inheritance. It is payment for all the work you did that I never gave you credit for. It is compensation for all the sacrifices you made. Most importantly, it is my way of saying thank you for loving me when I had nothing to offer you but dreams. The room was completely quiet now except for the sound of Linda's crying. Even Dorothy Coleman had stopped making angry comments. Mr. Peterson read the final paragraph. Linda, I hope this money will give you the freedom to pursue all the dreams you set aside for our marriage. Travel the world, go back to school, start your own business, do whatever makes you happy. You deserve all the joy and success that life can offer. You are a remarkable woman, and I was lucky to have you love me even though I did not deserve it. Please forgive me if you can. With all my love and deepest regrets, Richard. The lawyer folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. He handed it to Linda, who was still crying quietly. Amanda stood up slowly, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. Without saying a word, she picked up her purse and walked toward the door. At the doorway, she turned back and looked at Linda. I hope you'll be happy, Amanda said in a broken voice. Then she left the room. One by one, the other family members also got up and left. Some of them looked angry, others looked embarrassed. Dorothy Coleman was the last to leave. She stopped next to Linda's chair and looked down at her. "I was wrong. About you," the old woman said quietly. "Richard was right. You are a good person, and we treated you badly. I am sorry." Then Dorothy Coleman left too, and Linda was alone in the conference room with Mr. Peterson. "Mrs. Martinez," the lawyer said gently, "I know this is a lot to process. Would you like me to arrange for someone to drive you home?" Linda wiped her eyes and looked up at him. "Mr. Peterson, is this real? Did Richard really leave me all that money?" "It's very real, Mrs. Martinez. You are now a very wealthy woman. Richard made sure everything was legal and binding. No one can challenge this will successfully." Linda sat quietly for a few more minutes, holding Richard's letter and trying to understand how her life had just completely changed. She thought about her tiny apartment and her part-time job at the bookstore. She thought about all the dreams she had given up and all the possibilities that were now open to her. For the first time in 3 years, Linda Martinez smiled a real, genuine smile. Richard had finally kept a promise to her, even though it came too late for both of them.